as you can see down at the bottom, I've given this more than 3 times, but I've captured. Because I often give these months apart, there's a review at the beginning that I'm going to just go really quickly through so that we have time to do this. Here are the 3 church buildings that all play a part in the 19th century. And we talked quite a bit about the old one, the 1744, and we're just coming up in this talk to the 1809 building built for Channing that wasn't there all that long because they moved up to the Back Bay as you know it now. Again, this is the review of part 1. If you weren't there, I'm sure these slides can be made available. 2 of the major highlights were the American Revolution and the Massachusetts Constitutional Convention, causing the name of the previous Church Street to change from Long Lane to Federal Street. So as we turn the century, a minister who was with us a very short time, he was actually preferring to go be a Harvard professor with a country church up in Newbury. He's at the helm, but he's about to make way for Channing. Before I get into people, I'm going to do a little bit more with landscape because you can't tell Boston stories in this era without landscape. I'm going to go pretty fast because I want to get to the more specific stories. So these are the key questions we'll be addressing. What was happening in Boston at this time? Why did Channing decline large and affluent congregations to serve Federal Street? What did this congregation have to do with establishing Unitarianism in America? During the Antislavery Controversy, who were the Lords of the Loom and the Lords of the Lash? Why did the congregation move to its current location? And what was the Pew Controversy? What about other social justice projects? We're going to try to get all that in. I'm going to go pretty fast through the stuff about the city and the landscape. This is the map I meant to end with last time, but I found out it was in this presentation. Jeremy Belknap was one of our last ministers, and he was the one who was just awesome because he was a historian and a public health documenter. And he drew this wonderful map in his journal. Tell me if you can see my arrow or not. Can you see the arrow I'm slot? Okay, good. So here we have the church at the corner of Federal and Franklin Street. In blue, Belknap has shown all of the different homes he lived in. He moved a lot for 10 years. You can see where Trinity Church was before it moved to Back Bay. It was down in that area. And Old South is our consistent landmark. One thing you might not know, there was a terrible fire this year. That's why he drew the map. It started up in these rope walks. Rope walks were terribly undesirable, but very important. They were one of the stinkiest, messiest things to be located anywhere near. But if you're in a shipping economy, they're just critical. And they're these long, long rope walks. If you go over to the Navy Yard, you can't go in the building, but you can see it's like a 1/4 mile long building that held a rope walk. And this was so close to the church. And that's where the fire started. No surprise when people were working with hot tar. The other thing that's interesting is there was a theater right across. And somewhere I read, I can't find it, during Gannett's time, some of the young ladies used to slip out of evening prayer meeting to get to the theater. And he wasn't real happy about that, but that was kind of funny. And he is, again, Belknap is a preservationist. He's showing houses that were saved during the fire. I just thought you might like to see some of his documentation, how much he gave to our city and to our church and to history. So again, going fast, this is the Boston Peninsula in 1630 when First Church that some of us were chatting about started. The down where Fennel Hall is in the old State House is where all the action was. Up here is where the State House, there were 3 tall hills called the Tri-Mountain that later on the tops of the hills were cut off to fill the coves and build out the landfill. I cribbed these from another presentation, but this gives you a good 19th century overview. We start with the 18th century peninsula, and this is the area up around North Station, the Mill Pond, and 50 acres were filled there. And the new State House is built at the end of the 18th century at the top of Beacon Hill, out in the middle of nowhere. Nobody lived up there. So they've added 10% land. Then by 1845, we start to get the South Cove, which added a huge amount of land. And that's where the orange line goes through Chinatown and the medical center. And then this so-called Great Cove was filled in by wharfing out. Where wharfs had been built, they filled them in. And so the city is greatly changing. What used to be nearly on the shoreline is sort of getting pushed inland. By 1865, they have filled in the whole west part of Boston. And of course, they've started to fill the Back Bay, but only just barely, because we were the first public building in 1859. And again, they're creating rope walks on all this newly filled land. So, and Charles Street, I think, is what they're referring to here, between the public garden and the common. So they're getting toward the Back Bay. Now by 1890, which is the next step in this presentation I borrowed from, they've filled in the whole Back Bay, added 570 acres, which is more than the original Boston. It completely changed the landscape during this century. And that's really important because people then had choices. Initially, people lived on Beacon Hill, and then the South End got filled, and those older buildings are down there. And after mid-century, people started moving to the Back Bay, which is very much a part of this story. And this is sort of a final one showing you all the different acreages. I don't really need to say more about that. So I love these maps that are a superimposition. This square would be the Bank of Boston, and it shows you the location of the church was really right on the corner that's practically in the intersection. But I love this because you can see all the old lanes and streets, but then you can see where giant buildings. It is unrecognizable without these wonderful maps. This is a map after the 1809 building was built, which we'll get to. But again, you can see that location compared to the Bank of Boston, whatever it's called today. I can't keep up with the changes. Again, I showed you this last week. It's the first photo ever taken from a balloon in the US. And we're looking down Franklin Street. I've been torn. Sometimes I think this is the exact location, but then I've started to wonder a little bit about this area. In 1860, they just took the old church down. So I'd love to talk to someone who knows. I always meant to research it more and did not. This is an interesting one from this point of view, down on High Street, looking up Federal Street in 1867. It's still not that grown up. It's congested, but the streets are wide and the buildings are low. That's the neighborhood after the church was taken down and the congregation moved to Arlington Street. This is a really important slide. This is the Great Boston Fire of 1872. It started, so let's see, I marked, there's the old church on Federal Street and there's Arlington Street. This fire started here and on a Saturday night and continued to burn most of the city. It was unrecognizable. Look how close it even got to Old South. And that was really important for historic preservation. People threw wet towels and sheets and cloth all over the Old South roof, and they saved it. And that's been one of the first examples of historic preservation. But I think it was a very close call when you think about where that is. So if this church had not decided to move to the Back Bay, they would have lost everything in this fire, even the beautiful plaques we have from the old church. So it was very controversial. People did not want to leave a church that had been Channing's church, but it was a fortuitous decision for them. I love these old stereo cards. You can often find them online these days. This is the aftermath of the Boston fire on Federal Street. There was nothing left to work with. And here's another one showing the aftermath of the whole burned out district. The good thing was Boston rebuilt a lot more safely, and that certainly boded well. And sometimes after a fire, the rebuilding that happens is a preservation movement of its own, just with new codes and standards. I love this picture here of the fireboat at the bottom. We still have those. Like if you ever see the Constitution, the ship go out, they're always led by the fireboats with their water cannons. Just a few more maps. You've often seen the pictures that show the church right here. This is a little bit afterwards, but before the fire. You'll see this little street here called Channing Street. That, of course, was after Channing's death, probably named that in the 1850s or 1840s. He died in 1842. But that was also had another name previously that all of you seminarians will know very, very well. Previous to being Channing Street, it was Berry Street or Bory Street. I've seen things on the old maps. And the church was here. And from what I understand, the vestry, which they built quite a bit after the original church, was on the other side of Channing Street. I'm not sure exactly when they built the vestry. It's somewhere in the notes that I donated back to the church. So you guys have all my folders with tons of information. But the Berry Street lectures began here and are a very important part of Unitarian Universalism today. And that's just a final slide showing you the old plaque. I've heard they have a new one, not the same one anymore, but somewhere in the base where there's shrubbery, you can find a plaque. If I get back to Boston, it's been a long time, I might go looking for the new one to take a picture, but someone could send me a picture if you get there before I do, someone who works downtown. Okay, now 19th century. Railroads were a critical part of the 19th century economy. And you've got to imagine all this Back Bay land. There's Arlington Street Church. It was an open basin with these two rail lines. And you're thinking, why is she telling us about railroads? Well, some of you have parked on Providence Street if you drive a car. The Providence Street was the location of the Providence Station. The intersection was Back Bay Station as we know it today of these two routes. There is no longer a line to Providence where it used to be. And I think that was a great improvement for the neighborhood. South Station wasn't built till 1899 over here. So these railroads are extremely important in how the land developed and what went on it and who bought where. So let me show you more. This is an 1874 map that I love because it's a cadastral map. The names of the owners of the properties are here. Here's your church. And look at Arlington Street did not go through. I don't believe that happened till around 1909. It's a solid row of brick townhouses, but back behind it is both a passenger station, that's Providence Street there, and a freight depot. It was noisy, it was smelly, it was probably not real pleasant. And yet here they're building up the Back Bay with these gorgeous avenues. So I think that's why this station was certainly not continued. Back then, Boston was kind of like London, where you have a different station going to Boston, to Maine, going to Providence, Lowell, Maine. There were all these stations at perimeters all around the city. And kind of like in England, I don't think they had a subway that went in a circle like London does, because that really works there. Okay, last one. We're looking at the intersection. And then here's an earlier picture of the trains, an engraving in 1844, showing the trains coming into a very open Back Bay. The landscape was totally transformed in every way. So I'm jumping from landscape to some of the questions that I said I would address. So this is Channing, who served us from 1803 to 1842. And in 2003, when Boston hosted GA, our Joan Goodwin of our beloved memory, I still miss her, she helped me write a wonderful drama showing what happened during the 18 teens in Boston, and all the carryings on between the liberals and the conservatives. That play is still available in the notes I donated. Kim narrated it, and a lot of elder ministers who are no longer with us, like Dorothy Baruch and David Johnson, were just fabulous in that. I hope there's a video somewhere. I don't know. So Channing was born in 1780 in Newport to a family that had some slaves. He prepared at Harvard. One of the most figural events in his life was tutoring in a slaveholding family in Virginia. He ascribed to a lot of very ascetic practices. I suspect he didn't find anything less than perfection acceptable from what I've read of him. He wanted to be as perfect as he could. And what he would do is sleep on the floor and eat bread and cold water. I think he was trying, to be really candid, to sort of still any urges of the flesh, not to be too gross here, but I think he was trying to be in total control. Well, he broke his health. And that is why he wanted a smaller, less demanding church. Of course, he was there, and 6 years later, it was one of the biggest, most popular churches in Boston. So he brought the fame with him. But he was never quite well, and he did have a colleague minister a little later on. So he accepted the call in 1803, and part of the drama we produced was reenacting his ordination. I think we got to do it twice at that GA, once down at the convention center and once at the church, and it was a lot of fun. I had been talking to an older retired minister. His first name's Frank. I'm drawing a blank on his last name. He had been out in Ohio, but previously he had served in Newport. And he told me that when he was the minister in Newport, they had Channing's robe on a shelf in the minister's study. Luckily, they have given it to Mass Historical Society. And one day I went over there with my camera. It's blacker than this, but I couldn't use flash in a dark place back then. This was before we had anything like an iPhone. And these were the best pictures I could get. The most amazing part is Channing was little. He was not a tall guy, and the gathers on this are enormous. This was such a voluminous robe, but it wasn't very long. So it is there, and the curator can show it to people if they're serious about doing some research about Channing, but it made my research it made me happy to see this. He was known for powerful preaching. Because of that, he was bringing in not just the old Scots-Irish that had stayed after the evacuation, but he was starting to attract Boston's movers and shakers, the forebears of some of the Brahmins. I don't think we use the term Brahmin quite yet, maybe more mid-century, especially associated with Beacon Hill. They had to build the new meeting house in 1809, a Bullfinch meeting house that could seat almost as many as Arlington Street. I think it could seat 900. He married his cousin. He wasn't that keen on marrying, but he explained to somebody that he thought she expected him to marry, so he did. And they had 4 children. Our drama really highlighted those liberal Orthodox pamphlet wars. Those people were as wild and rude as anything I've ever seen on Facebook or Twitter. they really, and they'd print them up and shoot them out, and then they'd come out with an opposing one. Channing is best known for his 1819 sermon, Unitarian Christianity, which was very skillfully delivered in Baltimore, because so many people wanted to see Unitarianism expand across the country, but were afraid it was too identified with Boston. So they were very cagey in deciding to do it at the ordination of Jared Sparks in Baltimore. It's tough reading. It's not too hard for me with an evangelical Bible background, but without that, some of this is tough reading. He did have that early time where he served as a tutor in Virginia to a family of slaveholders. It was described with a word that makes me uncomfortable, a benign form of slavery. I just can't really say that without putting giant air quotes around it. It was not the most extreme form of the slavery that was taking place in the islands. I think he knew more people who worked in the house and had housing and were perhaps better cared for, but slavery is slavery. But because of this, Channing was very late to come out against slavery. Many of the women in his congregation were pushing him very hard. They were quite the agitators. Other people rebuked him, other ministers. He finally took a trip to the West Indies and saw in 1835 terrible slavery in the islands, people who worked in the fields, horribly abused, and he came out hard against it. And once he did that, a lot of people in the congregation who were involved with the cotton mills, anybody rich in Boston was quite often involved with the cotton production up in Lowell and Lawrence, and they were tightly tied with the South, and many of them snubbed Channing for the rest of his life for finally taking a hard stand. Emerson wrote about Channing in one of his books. Of Dr. Channing, he spoke with warm admiration. The charm of his preaching is not to be discovered by reading his sermons. Whenever he spoke, it seemed an occasion. The heart of his audience rose to meet him. Here was something sufficient. The multitude found it good to be there and went away fed and satisfied. The lower one is about a school that Emerson and his brother had near Federal Street Church. So here is the beautiful building of which we have the wonderful model. I have to mention that Tori and her son restored a very busted model. I think it was that same year, Tori, back in 2003, or maybe even before. And then John Ellerton built the beautiful plexiglass case for it. I'm so glad we have it. It was designed by Bulfinch, but it was not considered one of Bulfinch's successes. It was a Gothic design, but it served our church very well. Let's see. That's the model. This is when it was completed. I think that's Tori's son's long ago living room. And the spires finally stood up straight. And this is what they started with. It was pretty beat up. And on the interior is a great amount of detail. The only real picture we have of the back of the church, they did eventually get an organ once they were no longer Presbyterian. And there's a lovely little pulpit, but the galleries, they really kept a lot of things from that design when they came to Arlington Street. There were pews right next to the pulpit, as was common in many churches of that time. And here is a picture. I think, Kim, you have the original photograph of this came from in your office. I found it and put it there a few years ago. Of course, these tablets, these are from that old church, and you can see where they were. This would have all been lost in the fire. So we have just a few things. We have a little bit of the pulpit, just about that much in the chapel. And and then there were these heavy draperies behind it and these long stairs to get up there. Now, one of the questions I mentioned is why did before I get to that, Channing was unusual in that he was willing to talk with people of other denominations. The Catholics were most unwelcome in late Puritan Boston, which the early 19th century still was in many ways. The Catholics had a hard time, even though they did manage to build a church, but Channing was very close to Bishop Cheverus. And they found that they had a great deal in common, and they talked, and both churches did things for the other church. So that's one of the earliest notes of ecumenicism, if I'm saying that right. And again, much later in the 20th century, Kim's mentor, Day Negreely, was known for the same thing. He was often on a pedestal, a podium with a Jew and a Catholic Monsignor and another Protestant. And it's one of the most wonderful cross-pollination that we had in a city that wasn't known for it. This is the cover to the Baltimore Sermon that I mentioned, Channing's Baltimore Sermon. And what was it? Jean Navius actually was quite clear about this with me, our beloved former associate minister of beloved memory. It defined American Unitarianism in relation to the Orthodox Christian position. And the word American is important here because there was a whole strain of English Unitarianism going on pretty well, but American Unitarianism had some unique aspects, and that would be beyond the time we have today. But there's the church in Baltimore and the interior of it and the cover. So that's some of the original manuscript to it. Great quote. We believe that all virtue has its foundation in the moral nature of man, that is in conscience or his, I can't see my slides behind some of the pictures, sense of duty, and in the process of forming his temple and life according to conscience. This is so much 19th century Unitarianism, believing, some of the quotes later in the sanctuary are progress, upward and onward towards perfection. It's an early version of that, virtue often stressed. So I mentioned that the Federal Street congregation was very much associated with establishing Unitarianism in America. Ezra Stiles Gannett ended up being Channing's colleague minister. Excuse me while I grab a cough drop here. He attended Harvard College And as Channing's health was weak because of his ascetic practices, hadn't taken good care of himself, so he really needed a colleague pastor. His skills perfectly complemented Channing's. Channing was a mystic, an inspirer, a deep sense of a person's own being. Gannett was a doer. He organized things. He helped organize the American Unitarian Association in the Federal Street Vestry in 1825. He also led the move to the Back Bay, leaving Federal Street Church. And all during the 1850s, he kept having the congregation vote on moving. They did not want to leave Channing's church. We can look back on those landscape pictures and see where it was all going. They were in the middle of it and they couldn't. And many were wanted to hold on and cling to what they had. He served as a colleague pastor. Oh, and it took 4 votes for them to finally agree to move. After Channing's death in 1842, Gannett served until his death in 1871. So he was able to preach Arlington Street's inaugural sermon. The church was built from 1859 to 61. And he was unfortunately killed very late in his life in a railroad accident up on the North Shore when a train had a collision, 1871. He kept trying to resign because he was so old and they wouldn't let him. Why was the American Unitarian Association important? Well, many Unitarian ministers didn't think we needed an association at all. They felt like they were doing quite well in their own churches. This was not the UUA we know today that creates curricula and hymn books. This was a place for ministers to gather and talk and support one another. It was just bringing together the ministers. It wasn't forming any kind of policy or managing much of anything. It was colleagues coming together. This is kind of a side slide. I think I'm just going to skip down past the Orthodox pamphlet war. So the Berry Street Ministerial Conference was formed 1825, and that's with the beginning of the Berry Street lectures during the ministerial days, which today are held before GA, if GA is in person. And that was the conference. It took on more and more leadership and, doing things like camps and young people's programs. But early on, it was just a gathering of people with ministers with similar needs and thoughts to talk about what they do and support one another. So 1961 was the merger. So I mentioned briefly the Lords of the Loom and the Lords of the Lash. When I worked with the Park Service, I worked over at the Longfellow House in Cambridge. And of course, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow married Frances Appleton, Fanny Appleton, and Gannett married them because the Appletons were very prominent members of Federal Street Church. And Ezra Stiles Gannett married them at their home on Beacon Hill. They were very wealthy, but Mr. Appleton, Fanny's father, was one of the biggest cotton owners. I think they ended up leaving for King's Chapel eventually because of all this stress. The anti-slavery debacle, which ended up being successful, but it divided so many people, really took place from, say, the 1830s right up through the Civil War in the 1860s. And it got more and more controversial. So Charles Sumner was the one who coined this quote about the Lords of the Loom in the North were as much dependent on and in business with the Lords of the Lash, actual slavery itself. So much more about this than I can say in this talk. Okay, just one slide. The Unitarians were very much divided, and most of you probably know something about this. Some wanted immediate emancipation. This is so wrong. We can't do it. Others wanted gradual emancipation or possibly colonization. Channing was an early proponent of colonization to Liberia, which ended up, for the few who tried it, being extremely difficult because they weren't from there. Of course, it was a powerful sectional issue, things like states' rights, property and business rights. There was so much for people of similar minds to be so divided about. Gannett was interesting because he talked later on when a former slave named Anthony Burns in the 1850s was captured by slave hunters and marched back to the wharf and taken back south. Gannett said, "I fear losing the Union over this. I respect our Constitution, which is so young." And Unitarian women very much emerged as leaders in the anti-slavery controversy. Margaret Fuller wasn't so much in the anti-slavery. Mariah Weston Chapman, and I have to tip my hat. I understand John David McLean is no longer among you in person. He was such a proponent of Mariah Weston Chapman. He knew a lot about her. He made sure I included her in this presentation. She's over on the right, Mariah. And she was a very active member of Federal Street Church and an ardent abolitionist. She had 5 abolitionist sisters, as well as a couple of brothers. I highly encourage you to read about her, even on Wikipedia. There's so much more than I can say. Fuller was an intellectual. She did so much, but she was extraordinary, her mind. Any of her writings are well worth reading today. She was a great influence of Channing. They both studied German theology today. She easily learned German and was very interested in theology. She was an extremely close friend of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Another one is Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, best known by many people for beginning the kindergarten movement, that children need to play and explore and experience things in the 19th century. And yet she also was a member of the church. Later, I believe she went to Church of the Disciples, which I'll talk more about in 2 weeks. But she was a key figure. Channing often observed her like hustling around. At one point he wrote, well, sometimes she's a bit untidy, but she knows everybody and everything and she gets things done. If you know Lydia Mariah Child, your first exposure to her was probably through her song Over the River and Through the Woods. But she was married to a Unitarian minister who was more involved in education, David Child, and they wrote incredible anti-slavery literature, and those were often published in periodicals of the day. So these people were very much known to the Federal Street congregation and very much trying to influence first Channing and then Ezra Stiles Gannett. I think so much more could be done with this. A lot of them have individual biographies now. Okay, I love this quote because this is the other side. It's great to think that Federal Street had all these abolitionists, but Channing was late to take a stand because of not seeing the worst case until 1835. And Gannett struggled with the fact that the Constitution was so hard won. Would we really break up the Union? So this is a book called Wendell Phillips, The Agitator. And without reading you the whole quote, the part I highlighted, he's naming the different churches. Where's Essex Street Church? Teaching that there are occasions when the golden rule is to be set aside. Where's Federal Street Church? Teaching that silence is the duty of the North with respect to slavery, and closing its doors to the funeral eulogy of the abolitionist Charles Follen. That was a sad story. The bosom friend of the only man who will make Federal Street pulpit to be remembered, William Ellery Channing. And I might ask, where are New South and Brattle Street churches? Wendell Phillips was a hardcore agitator. Again, much more is beyond our story, but he influenced so many people, but he also upset people because he was willing to make a scene. This is Channing's famous pamphlet when he finally came out against slavery. I guess it's dated 1836. Channing came slowly to his views, not because of doubts about its moral imperative, but because he feared it would fracture his congregation, devastate its financial base, the merchants and shippers who profited from Southern slavery. So like many controversies, this one's complicated. You can find people at Federal Street on both sides, and it did divide the congregation in many ways. A number went to more conservative churches like King's Chapel. So why did the congregation move? They had a nice church down there in what's now the financial district. Well, what happened was the Irish immigration of the 1840s. These were the Irish Catholics, not the Scots Irish that we talked about 2 weeks ago. The Irish were the group that were starving during this period, came over by shiploads, often didn't have the money to get beyond Boston and New York. And they took up lodgings in whatever room they could find, whatever boarding house. All of these small businesses and rooming houses basically crowded the church. That's a street with a wagon right in front of the church. That would be Channing Street or Berry Street. So the neighborhood had gotten pretty distasteful, and a lot of people who'd originally lived down in that area had moved to the South End at the turn of the 19th century. And then as the Back Bay started to be considered, that was clear it was going to become a more prosperous neighborhood. So by 1858, some people were scared to go to church or found it was very far from their prestigious home in the South End by foot or by horse. Okay, more maps. So here's Arlington Street, and then we know Federal Street was down here. So they start filling this way, or this way, it's almost easier to see. They had been making some land here. Originally, there were some people in the 1820s who thought that there was enough tide to power mills in the Back Bay. This is before anything was built there. Well, unfortunately, the tide never really cleaned the mud flats. And so between the 1820s and the 1850s, what is now those Back Bay grid of streets was a stinking mud flat. It did not turn out to be a financial success. The tide rolled in and then rolled out without being covered, but just left so much trash and mud. So the city decided to start filling. And the people in this church, they got their final vote, I think, in 1858 to let go of the old church and to move. And we were the first public building in the Back Bay. I love this picture. I think this is from 1862 because you can just see Emmanuel Church, which was the other early building, but Arlington Street was first. There are 999 pilings. They're all around the perimeter of the church because underneath the filled land is blue clay and water. So all of the buildings in the Back Bay, which most of you know, were built on pilings. And there are actually maps that show how the pilings go all around in a square. The cornerstone was laid in May 1860, and it was completed in 1861 and dedicated December 11th, 1861. The cost will make you cry, $106,000. I don't think you can do the smallest construction project for that these days. And the Back Bay streets were filled east to west. So the alphabet order is the order that they were filled. Here you can just see it looks like a flat brown prairie. You can see a little bit of the public garden fencing. Obviously, that took a long time to grow up. And Arlington Street with no traffic jam. What a concept. I miss hearing you guys laugh at my jokes. 1860, here's another picture. It's just amazing to me that we have this at all, just showing how the land was so empty. It must have been a shock coming from the other area, but they knew what was coming, and there were lots of plans about the row houses. They had hired Olmsted, the famous landscape architect, to lay out Commonwealth Avenue. The promise was that it would be like Paris with the beautiful avenues, and it is. So they dedicated the church in 1861. We've read that a few times in church. John Andrew, the governor during Civil War, was very supportive. Gannett's famous quote was, "We dedicate our house of prayer in troubled times when the sight of armed men is familiar in our streets." Now, the interior did not look anything like what it is today, at least not in the pulpit area. The pulpit was really low. It must have created a problem projecting one's voice, because of course there was no electronics in those days. What's always surprised me is that they ever chose a 3-part pulpit to You often think of that in Trinitarian churches, but they were obviously thinking classical architecture because that is very classical. There were no stained glass windows until 1899. So the windows created a great deal of brightness. And up here, when we were choosing paint colors for the church, or I should say the gay men were, when I heard them talking about 50 colors of beige, I left. I don't do 50 colors of beige, but they were distinguishing very carefully between all these different shades. I did some research and found this part had been painted terracotta, sort of the color of dark plant pots, the porous pottery ones. I can't imagine what that looked like, but it was much more colorful. Of course, it's beautiful today with the windows and the off-white, whatever that shade is. This is a fascinating photograph to me. We know it's 19th century. There's no Channing Monument. That came in 1903. Arlington Street doesn't go through until the early 20th century, maybe 1909. There's a solid row of houses here. And of course, back here is the railroad, the Providence Street lines. It was messy, noisy, and dirty. But what is this giant building? This is the Peace Coliseum that was built. It's a great thing to look up. It's hard to believe it was there. It was basically in Copley Square, but it was huge. And it was a place where people could come together for peace jubilees after the Civil War. It was such a horrible war and so many were lost that the interior was enormous and big brass bands would play there. It's worth looking up, Peace Jubilee Coliseum of Boston. I hope you can see it. I've got pictures partly covering it, but the church is decorated for Christmas interior, and you can see these beautiful swags, and then you can really see the terracotta contrast paint up above. I'm so glad we have at least one picture that shows the interior. They were really into greenery. The other story I forgot to tell that I've made Kim tell a few times is after they had bought the land for the church, but before they were ready to break ground, they allowed a circus to store their supplies there. And I think there was a circus tent set up for a while on the Arlington Street Church plot of land. So I don't have a slide for that, but it's one of my favorite stories. Somebody obviously knew somebody and they probably got some rent for the land before they were ready to build. The other thing you can see in this picture is the water. They haven't filled very far back, by 1860s after the war. Now, these plaques were in the front of the old church of Arlington Street Church when the pulpit was low. I'm sure many of you have stopped to read these. They moved them to the back of Arlington Street Church where I think they're better placed. They're beautiful and there's a lot of love in these, not epitaphs, but memorials. So if you haven't seen them, stop and read them. I don't have time to do it now. Okay, so after Gannett was finally killed, he tried so hard to resign, the poor guy. When he was finally killed, the church had to deal with his loss. And they recruited somebody who had an interesting history, not just in ministry, but he took enormous, powerful leadership in the Sanitary Commission in the Civil War. Well, what's the Sanitary Commission? What did they do? This was the forerunner of the Red Cross. Those of you who know your Civil War history know some of the stories about, in some of the Confederate prisons, at least, more men died of dysentery from horrible sanitation practices. All throughout the war, the way soldiers camped and ate and whether they drew their water from a river that was being used for toilet facilities, these people were well aware of what a difference they could make to soldiers if they didn't die before they got to the war. Reverend Ware took powerful leadership and he doesn't get much credit. He came from a long line of Unitarian ministers who were quite well known and outspoken. Some of them back to 1805 when there was a huge fight about whether the Harvard would go Orthodox or Unitarian. And it was the Woods versus Ware controversy, which all our seminarians will know. But Ware prevailed. That was it must have been his grandfather. So he served for 10 years. He also was averse to communion. Some of the Unitarian ministers, including Emerson, who was one, did not feel comfortable with the whole sacrament of communion. I mean, today we have water communion, which is quite different. But the whole idea of the body and the blood, any of you who've grown up in traditional churches know it well. The Catholics know that it's supposed to be transformed in some way to be the real body. He took a real strong stand against it. And I think they had it much less often. That was his influence. You'll see a plaque to him in the church. So what was the Pew controversy and what other social justice projects were undertaken? People always ask me about social justice, as you might. This is one of our most interesting ministers to me. His reputation was not unlike Kim's and Paul Revere Frothingham. He was best described as charismatic. Just really knew how to draw the people with charisma. He served from 1880s to I think 1891 or two. Again, my slide is slightly blocked. He is the first non-Harvard educated minister since the Congregationalists took hold in our church, and it was no longer Presbyterian. The Presbyterians hadn't gone to Harvard, but he was recruited from England. There's a lot of writing in the late 19th century about how Unitarianism was becoming, somebody described it as a cold corpse, I forget who. There was a lot of people were hanging on to the transcendentalist ideals of the 1830s and 40s. The abolition had taken such a strong toll. There was a lot of controversy about Unitarianism losing something. A lot of very prominent Boston Unitarians saw their way over to Episcopalianism, Anglican Church, and Trinity Church. Many of them made that jump. So they recruited him from England for his gifted preaching style. He had been in Chicago, but he was quite wonderful. There's a lot to be read about all these people. I think I have one more slide about him. Yes, the Pew controversy. This is a later Pew Deed. And those of you who've been around a while will recognize Jane W. Cheever. She's the aunt, I think, of Dan Cheever, but she might be his sister. People owned pews. This was pew number 41, and the proprietorship charge was the money you gave the church for the year. There was no canvas as we know it today. They might have passed a hat once in a while for something special, but it was your pew rent that paid the support for the church. So people owned these pews, and they were quite picky. I'm not saying Jane Cheever was, but many of them decorated their pew. You can see one of those over at King's Chapel if you go on the tour there, where people brought their own like an armchair for the father and footrests for the children who couldn't reach. Some of them even allowed dogs. They must have kept your feet nice and warm, because not all Boston churches had stoves until the 19th century. But our last Pew Deed at Arlington Street, I think, was finally turned in 1953. I was alive then, just barely, but within my lifetime. In the later 20th century, there was a real movement to turn them back in. But Brooke Herford was not used to this system coming from England. And he did something radical. He wanted more innovative programming, and he had observed all the couples courting on the common. And so what he did was he created a Vespers service on Sunday nights at 5 o'clock to draw on all the prosperous courting couples. And he thought if he could get the couples to come into the church with some beautiful orchestral music and a Vespers service, well, they might get married there and raise their families there. The guy was a good marketer. Well, the people who owned the pews had a fit. They couldn't imagine that he was going to let somebody just go sit in their pew. And he said, this is the work of the church. If you're not using it, other people should be able to. There was quite a major church fight. He prevailed. He lost a few supporters along the way, but he did prevail that at special services, other people would be allowed to sit in the pews. It's hard to imagine that being an issue. Okay, here's the social justice part. There's one I'll talk about in particular because I added it just recently. The women's, that's the second one, but the women's auxiliary, this was such a big part of 19th and early 20th century Unitarian churches. Also, the Universalists had a form of these. The women got together, they kept wonderful, wonderful notes. I had their records at home for a long time. I gave them back when I returned all the files, but they often reached out into the community. One thing they did was teach sewing. They would teach sewing to poor women, to immigrant women. They would have sewing classes in the 20th century. Once we had a kitchen and a parish hall, which we didn't have in the 19th, they would have cooking classes and health classes and sponsor TB, tuberculosis nurses. One of the best ones, and I'll show you some slides, is the Freedmen's Aid Society after the war. The benevolent fraternity was very important in the 19th century. This was Unitarians, and I don't know if there were other denominations. I think it was mainly Unitarian, joined together. And I'm drawing a blank. Kim, can you help me? What is it called today?
Do you mean the Women's Alliance?
No, the benevolent fraternity.
Oh, Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry.
Urban Ministry.
Urban Ministry, thank you. See, I'm beginning to forget things. And that was greatly supported by the people at Arlington Street and by many, many Boston. And it was a way to pool your resources and also to sponsor some ministry into the community. The church often went out and recruited non-members' children to come to Sunday school. There was quite a Sunday school program. It had curricula and, like many churches of the era, awards for longevity of attendance. That was very important. And often the young people in the church would invite non-members' children to the Sunday school and grow the church that way. I already talked about the Sanitary Commission, and of course, the church supported the Red Cross and the forming of the AUA back in 1825. But let me talk about the Freedmen's Aid Society, because this is new research. This is Governor Andrew, again, our Civil War governor, who's supporting and promoting the Freedmen's Aid Society to help people after the war. They theoretically began to get rights with amendments to the Constitution, but the education was a huge problem. Here we have a pamphlet or flyer showing that an organizational meeting with some very prominent people was being held at ASC to call meetings in different wards, different neighborhoods of Boston. This was huge. And at this point, the church was very prominent. The church was full of people with money. There were probably just a few descendants of the original Presbyterians, if any. But Channing had certainly brought prominent people, and Gannett just added. So before Gannett died in 1871, he helped organize a meeting. Well, this was an exciting find. And I wish, again, I gave back all my files, so I don't know which handbook this came from, but this is from an Arlington Street handbook. There is a window, I think in the chapel, to the Grew family. So we have the president, the treasurer, the secretary, but then this is Peter H. Woolfolk and Sarah P. Little. We sponsored teachers in Richmond, Virginia and Hilton Head, South Carolina, to the freedmen. I love that our church did that. People asked me for years, did we do anything to help the freed slaves? And I can finally say, yes, we did. I poked around in some Richmond city directories and sure enough found that Peter Woolfolk was in Richmond for a long, long time. And what's interesting is I worked on a Richmond project for the Park Service for many years, 4 years. A woman named Maggie Lena Walker, a Black woman who was the first woman banker and also the first CEO of an insurance company. And I see many names here, like John Dabney was an important Black publisher. If you're traveling in the South someday when we can travel again, also Ransom, these names all resonate with me. Jackson Ward in Richmond is an amazing Black neighborhood, and you can tour Maggie Walker's home and learn about her amazing work supporting people during the worst years of Jim Crow. But again, we had people down there. Richmond was one of the worst places. Over on the right is a letter about Sarah Lilly's work with the school. Again, I won't read it in detail, but if a church could support these people, they often got a lot of information back. So I love this story, and it's newly added here. Here are a few pictures just showing the transition as the trees are growing up in the public garden. The church has a railing around it. People have asked if that was because of snow, because it's not there now. I don't know what it was for. I like it. It looks lovely. It just may not have lasted and been hard to replace. This isn't I would have loved to have seen this in color. It wasn't possible. But again, the public garden looked quite different. There were many changes, but the church was a critical part of the landscape. It was featured constantly on postcards and brochures and flyers because of its proximity to the public garden. People knew the church, even people from out of town. I'm almost to the end here, and I have a good joke coming up. Our final minister was very different than the others. He was actually recruited when Reverend Herford wanted to return to England to retire and be with his family because he was English. So he recruited his friend John Cookson. This was not a happy marriage. But the irony is, after John Cookson was asked to leave Arlington Street, it's the only minister I know who was, what do they call it, a negotiated settlement in ministry terms. He went on to Plymouth, Massachusetts, where by the time he died, he was beloved and esteemed and revered. And I was just thinking, our seminarians need to hear that. It doesn't always work out in the first placement, and then sometimes you're just a perfect fit for another one. But it was a difficult time in our history, better known as the Gilded Age, when just like today, some people were trying to have business be all and not paying much attention to who was being exploited to make that happen. The post-war struggles were getting worse. New technologies and opportunities were coming about through science. The social injustice was terrible. The health problem that I most know about with John Cookson was narcolepsy. He fell asleep in meetings, and he even apparently nodded off in the pulpit. I can't imagine during a sermon, but maybe during a hymn or something. And I did find records, and they're in the records I had and gave back, that it was the narcolepsy that really caused people to ask him to leave the Pew. Now, I also found some diaries of prominent young women, and they're probably there too. And he was considered boring by the young people of Boston. It may be that people in Boston expected more. They had heard people like Phillips Brooks at Trinity, who was another charismatic preacher. But it may be down in quieter Plymouth, the expectations were different. But it was not a happy pastorate. And I think that's the only one I know of that we can say that about. So this brings us up to 1900, but I found the best quote in a clipping online today. I wish I could hear you laugh. Arlington Street Church held gay throng today, but this was a rather traditional wedding. I was searching for anything more about Cookson and this popped up, but I think it's an absolutely wonderful quote that you all should embrace, maybe at Pride, next time when we can ever have Pride in person, but that just made my day. Okay, so we got through.
Please visit ascboston.org for more information about this historic Unitarian Universalist congregation. Arlington Street Church, gathered in love and service for justice and peace.